The announcement did not begin with applause. It began with silence, the heavy, electric kind that settles over a room when everyone senses history shifting beneath their feet. The emergency summit in Brussels had already stretched for hours. Delegations from across the European Union sat behind polished nameplates, their faces illuminated by soft white lights and the glow of translation screens. Outside, rain streaked down the glass facade of the building, blurring the flashing cameras of journalists gathered below. No one expected what came next. The official agenda focused on energy resilience and economic coordination. But behind the prepared statements and diplomatic language, tensions had been building for months. Inflation had squeezed households. Factories had slowed production. Small businesses across the continent whispered the same complaint. Survival was becoming harder. When the first delegate from one of the 7 nations pressed their microphone button, the faint click echoed louder than it should have. "Colleagues," the representative began calmly, "we must address the consequences of our current trajectory." The phrasing was careful, almost surgical. Yet everyone understood what it meant. Across the table, officials from Germany shifted in their seats. The French delegation exchanged glances but remained composed. For years, unity had been the guiding principle. Publicly, at least, the bloc had maintained a synchronized stance. The delegate continued. "Our citizens demand stability. Our industries demand clarity. It is our duty to examine whether our policies are achieving their intended results." A murmur moved through the hall like a ripple through still water. The second country stood moments later. Their tone was firmer. "We do not speak of abandoning principles. We speak of practicality. Energy costs are crippling our manufacturing sector. Households are struggling through winters that grow colder economically, if not meteorologically." The word energy seemed to strike a nerve. Screens flickered as advisors typed frantically. Outside the chamber, aides rushed down corridors, phones pressed tightly to their ears. Then came the third voice, measured but unmistakably direct. "Dialogue is not weakness. Engagement is not betrayal. Strategic interests evolve." The implication was clear. Isolating Russia had brought consequences that could no longer be ignored. At that moment, something shifted in the atmosphere. It wasn't dramatic. There were no raised voices. No one slammed a fist on the table. But the carefully constructed facade of total unity had cracked. Television networks across Europe cut into regular programming. Headlines began forming in real time. 7 EU nations call for policy review. Brussels faces internal divide. Analysts were pulled into studios with barely a minute's notice. Inside the summit hall, the 4th delegate rose. "Our agricultural sector is under unprecedented strain," they said. "Fertilizer prices have doubled. Transport costs continue to rise. Farmers in our country are asking us a simple question: what is the long-term plan?" The question hung unanswered. The 5th representative added another layer. "We must consider global competitiveness. Other regions are recalibrating. If we fail to adapt, we risk long-term economic erosion." By now, no one could pretend this was routine debate. 7 nations, not marginal members, but economically significant players, were signaling coordinated dissatisfaction. Across the room, a senior official from France finally leaned toward their microphone. "Unity has been our strength," they reminded the chamber. "Fragmentation would send a dangerous signal, not only to external actors, but to markets and to our own citizens." The message was a warning wrapped in diplomacy. Yet the 6th of the 7 responded almost immediately. "Unity must be rooted in results," they countered. "If our shared approach produces hardship without measurable progress, we have an obligation to reassess." Cameras zoomed in on faces that remained outwardly composed but inwardly tense. The translators' voices, usually a soft background hum, now seemed sharper, more urgent. Outside the building, protesters had begun gathering. Some waved banners demanding relief from rising costs. Others insisted on maintaining pressure. The divide in the chamber mirrored the divide on the streets. The 7th and final nation rose slowly. Their statement was brief, and perhaps the most consequential. "We propose a structured review of current measures and the reopening of limited diplomatic channels to evaluate potential stabilization mechanisms." The phrase "reopening channels" sent shockwaves through media outlets within seconds. Inside Moscow, late-night broadcasts interrupted regular programming. Analysts debated whether this signaled a genuine shift or simply political posturing. Government officials monitored the summit carefully, aware that even rhetorical changes inside the EU could have strategic implications. Back in Brussels, the room felt smaller. A senior advisor from Germany requested a recess. Delegations retreated into private rooms. Doors closed. Conversations intensified behind soundproof walls. Some leaders feared that markets would interpret this as weakness. Others argued that ignoring internal strain posed a greater risk. Economic data was projected onto screens. Manufacturing output declines, energy import costs, consumer sentiment surveys. Numbers rarely lie, but they can be interpreted in many ways. As the recess ended and delegates returned to their seats, it was clear that the summit would not conclude quietly. Even if no immediate policy change occurred, the psychological barrier had been broken. For the first time since the crisis began, 7 EU nations had openly questioned the sustainability of the current course, and done so together. In the press briefing room downstairs, reporters prepared for statements that could redefine Europe's political landscape. Microphones were adjusted. Lights brightened. When the doors finally opened and officials stepped forward, the world leaned in. No dramatic declarations followed. No policies were reversed overnight. But the language had shifted, from certainty to evaluation, from rigid alignment to cautious reconsideration. And in geopolitics, language is power. As night settled over Brussels, city lights reflected off rain-soaked streets. Inside apartments across Europe, families watched coverage unfold. Some felt hope that economic pressure might ease. Others feared instability. What had begun as an emergency summit had transformed into something larger, a moment of reckoning. 7 nations had not rebelled in the traditional sense. They had done something quieter. They had questioned. And in the delicate architecture of the European Union, that question echoed louder than any declaration. The hours after the summit felt unlike any other in recent European memory. It wasn't chaos. It wasn't celebration. It was uncertainty, deep, strategic, and impossible to ignore. As night blanketed Brussels, lights remained on inside the headquarters of the European Union. Staff moved quickly through corridors carrying briefing folders. Emergency consultations were scheduled before dawn. Markets in Asia were only hours away from opening, and every word spoken during the summit was already being dissected by analysts around the world. The 7 nations had not withdrawn from common policy. They had not announced a dramatic shift, but they had done something far more disruptive. They legitimized debate. In Warsaw, senior officials from Poland convened a late-night security meeting. Their position remained firm. Unity must not fracture. Public statements emphasized resilience and strategic patience. The message was clear. Recalibration could not become retreat. Meanwhile, leaders from the Baltic region issued coordinated remarks stressing caution. They argued that geopolitical pressure required consistency, not wavering. Television studios in Tallinn, Riga, and Vilnius hosted urgent discussions about regional security and long-term stability. Across the continent in Berlin, the government of Germany found itself balancing economic reality with political responsibility. German industry leaders had quietly warned for months about rising costs and global competitiveness. Now, with 7 nations openly calling for review mechanisms, those concerns entered mainstream debate. Paris was equally measured. Officials from France emphasized the importance of strategic autonomy, a phrase that suddenly took on new weight. France did not endorse fragmentation, but it acknowledged that policy effectiveness must be evaluated continuously. Inside Russia, state analysts interpreted the development cautiously. Evening broadcasts framed it as evidence of shifting sentiment within Europe, yet seasoned observers reminded viewers that EU decision-making moves slowly and rarely changes overnight. Still, diplomatic channels that had been dormant for months began to stir with quiet inquiries. The real shockwave, however, rolled through financial markets. Energy futures fluctuated sharply. Investors speculated whether supply arrangements might soften or diversify. Manufacturing stocks across Europe experienced volatile trading as analysts revised forecasts. The word uncertainty appeared repeatedly in financial briefings. But beneath market reactions lay something deeper: political recalibration. Within 48 hours, think tanks in Brussels published policy briefs exploring structured review frameworks. Economists proposed phased assessment models. Security experts debated whether limited engagement could coexist with firm deterrence. The proposal from one of the 7 nations, a 6-month review mechanism, became the focal point of discussion. It was not framed as reconciliation. It was presented as accountability. If measures are effective, they will withstand review, one policy advisor argued during a televised debate. If they are not, adjustment strengthens rather than weakens us. The framing mattered. Across European capitals, Public opinion polls showed rising interest in pragmatic solutions. Citizens were not demanding dramatic reversals. Many were demanding clarity. They wanted timelines, measurable outcomes, transparency. The 7 nations understood this shift. Their governments had faced mounting domestic pressure, protests over energy bills, concerns from small business associations, agricultural unions warning about input costs. The summit had not created these issues. It had amplified them.